Thanks for hosting us today.
The recording is in progress.
I heard that. We're really happy to be here. We have Kalinda Magloire, who is a technical director in MSI's Peace and Stability practice. She developed a fragility systems diagnostic tool that we want to share with the peace building community. It's still in early stages under peer review, and we plan to pilot it, but that'll be the initial presentation that we'll be looking at. We're also joined by Mike Jobbins, who's VP for Global Affairs and Partnerships at Search for Common Ground, and Bronwen Morrison, who's a Senior Director at Valar, and Julie Werbel, Division Chief for Leadership and Learning for USAID CPS CVP. Got it. So we'll start with Kalinda's presentation. Virtual participants, please feel free to drop questions in the chat. And I think Megan will also share in the chat a link to a new publication out of MSI on localization and conflict context. Folks are welcome to read and ask questions about as well. So, Kalinda, over to you.
Thank you, Christy. I will share my screen. Are we good?
Share this.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Good. I'll eventually get there. All right. Hi, everyone. Solstice is a fragility systems diagnostic tool. Why now, and why after so many other tools? In the past 2 years, 80% of the countries that have a USAID mission or program can be described as fragile or conflict affected. And Solstice is there to respond to a need that practitioners have to be able to program right away. So it's there to provide a rapid analysis to inform immediate practical application for a programming response in fragile and conflict affected environments. The tool takes a system approach to conflict and stability, such as it is designed to first analyze the full ecosystem in which fragility and conflict is able to perpetuate itself, and also work with those systems actors to define what solutions, what is the problem driving the fragility and conflict, and how to develop locally led programming responses to promote peace and stability. The tool is made to identify the multiple factors and their interconnection that allow fragility to perpetuate. There are a lot of tools that we could call similar out there. Due to the growing threat of VE, many tools have been developed to establish early warning systems, diagnose and program to counter violent extremism. However, certain regions are not directly threatened by VE. It does not mean that they're not fragile, that they're not vulnerable to criminalized economies, drug and arms trafficking, corruption, political instability, etc. So Solstice tried to go beyond the identification of the VE drivers to be broad enough to be applied to any fragile or conflict affected context. We recognize that each context is unique and dynamic, and the tool is designed to be iterative, such that the diagnostic should happen on an ongoing basis. We start programming and then it informs the tool, and we start the process all over again, with the necessary adaptations made to programming in real time. Another thing that I think that makes Solstice different is that it focuses heavily on historical pattern that from many places constitute important impediment and prevent countries to get out of that vicious circle of fragility. Assessment tools tend to take a snapshot of the current situation and neglect colonial or post-colonial inheritances, impact of ethnical divides, pattern of social exclusion based on race, religions, land tenure, nature of the state, etc. And that's what we try to address with this tool. But there's a lot of things that this tool is not. It is not an early warning system, but it's meant to be a systemic diagnostic tool for countries stuck in a spiral of fragility and instability. It's not a ranking tool either. Therefore, indicators used are not going to be weighted systematically, but rather interconnected with each other to form a systemic diagnostic. This tool is not necessarily a knowledge sharing tool, as the results of the assessment might draw sensitive conclusions on different stakeholders that we might have to interact with in the future for programming. Therefore, all of the results might not be shareable. Finally, this tool is not permanent. It's not an unchangeable method. It's a tool aimed at developing practitioners who will in turn have the possibility to test it, to modify it, and improve it. This tool uses the structural and behavioral characteristic of market systems, resilience, among other indicators, to analyze the full ecosystem in which fragility is maintained and to assess the root causes of fragility in a country labeled as such. Theories of market systems resilience have identified structural and behavioral characteristics such as connectivity, diversity, power dynamics, rule of law, cooperation, competition, and decision-making. We have chosen what we thought were the most accurate of them for this tool. It can be argued that building market system capabilities along those lines cannot as well help to respond to the drivers of conflict, insecurity, and fragility. USAID's market system resilience framework defines resilience along a continuum. Solstice applies a similar logic, but considers the societal and communal factor beyond only the market. On this stabilization continuum, the proactive endgame is the end of fragility. This tool also uses as premise that all the characteristics of fragility are so deeply interconnected that they cannot be addressed separately, but have to be addressed as a system. For this tool, the preferred system will be the society as a whole, even if in some cases it can be used to analyze a region with very distinct specificities or clusters of country, if homogeneous enough in their profile and level of fragility. Finally, one thing that is important to mention is, although we have tried to privilege rapidness, this tool operates under the do no harm umbrella. So there will be some precautions to be taken to make sure that this tool is implemented properly and does not do any harm. Like I mentioned before, Solstice is based on the assumption that peace and stability capacities of a society, as opposed to its fragility, can be defined in terms of structural and behavioral patterns. However, we add other domains such as history, ethnic dynamics, social norms and culture, political dynamics, and human development levels to provide a holistic approach of a fragile society. In terms of programming, progressing along the stabilization continuum in each of these interconnected characteristics can then be translated into what we call a sub-theory of change that define the realm of possible interventions. For the sake of rapidness, we did have to limit the number of characteristics. It was a difficult thing to do. We started at 11 and finished at 5. And for each of them, we have identified 4 key questions. The first characteristics are connectivity and diversity. These are drawn from the market system framework. Connectivity is defined by the manner and degree to which social actors interact with each other and the quality of this relationship. Too many or too few connections can hamper the way society reaches consensus on these key issues. Too few connections reflect the absence of dialogue among different actors and a social divide impeding the reach of consensus. When we talk about diversity here, it should not be considered as multi-ethnicity, but through the prism of social diversity. In this model, a lack of diversity is evidenced by a society dominated by an homogeneous small elite with common characteristic, whether it's ethnicity, geographic location, political affiliation, etc., with no space for other actors. The second characteristic is power dynamics and security. These are the power dynamics are defined as the relative concentration and exercise of power in a society. Too much concentration of power can limit voice, while too little can result in an inability to reach consensus or key decision. How power is exercised can be assessed along a continuum from a society that reinforces a concentration of power for the benefit of a few at one end, to a society that reinforces diversity of power for broader and more inclusive social benefits. And so you can see for each of these characteristics, we have 4 questions. And the intent of these 4 questions is to try to capture the whole of the issue. However, we'll see later in the methodology that each team addressing one country will have to adapt these questions to make sure that they fit the context that they're trying to study. This one is a large one. If we cheated a bit, it could have been separated in 3 characteristics, but we decided to have 5. So rule of law, state-society relationship, and patterns of governance. The state-society relationship is at the heart of fragility. In this relationship, what practitioners want to look for to position the society on what we call the stabilization continuum are the dynamics of inclusion versus exclusion, cohesion versus fragmentation, and the dynamics of resource generations and access. At the end of this stabilization continuum, state-society relationship is characterized by inclusion, cohesion, and the ability to provide resources that generate patterns of governance that heighten a country's capacity to manage and mitigate stresses. Patterns of governance reflect how power and authority are wielded. They also reflect the perceived legitimacy and effectiveness of the state to collectively solve problems, provide essential public goods and services, and manage shocks and stresses. Legitimacy refers to perceptions of inclusiveness, trust, fairness, and as well as perceived right to govern, which may be conferred by heredity or elections or other factors. Capacities. This characteristic actually emerges from the patterns of governance, reflecting how the state and society manage internal and external stresses, and that impact commitment and ability to meet political, economic, social, security, and environmental needs. Capacities have the potential to manage and mitigate stresses, but they can also be negative and generate internal stresses of their own. Finally, the 5th characteristic are the stresses themselves. They can be generated internally, emerging from a pattern of governance, or externally. Internally generated stresses place an additional strain on the state-society relationship and resulting pattern of governance. Examples are corruptions, or sustained inequitable access to education and health services, for instance. External stresses, or they occur independently of the governance dynamics. They can be drought conditions, other natural disasters, influx of refugees, economic stresses such as increase in food or fuel prices. The impact of these external stresses will be mitigated or magnified by the collective capacity. Now that we've pretty much laid out the different characteristics that we've identified, onto a bit, and I will not focus a lot on the methodology, but it can be divided in 3 phases. The first one is the identification, and it's identified the different elements contributing to fragility. It's basically answering the question arising from the 5 characteristics that we've mentioned earlier. In the second phase, the team will interconnect the different characteristics and see how their relationship among each other allow fragility to perpetuate. And once this is done, and this phase also include not an extensive one, but a basic stakeholder mapping. The third phase is actually what we're looking for, which is the elaboration of sub-theories of changes for each clusters of answers and the drawing of activities for each of these characteristics. This tool is aiming to provide a rapid analysis. So data collection, in our view, should not take more than 2 weeks. It does combine quantitative and qualitative data, allowing it to be flexible to go back in time to examine history, ethnical dynamics, social norms and culture, political dynamics, livelihoods, human development level, etc. The way we see it, the data come from 3 mainstreams: pre-existing quantitative data sets, content analysis, and qualitative expert analysis. The pre-existing data sets will be chosen from validated international organizations and organizations with a presence in the country to be studied. The team will refine the set of questions to be answered according to the context. The context analysis stems from the there is also a part that's going to be done remotely and stemming from the identification of keywords linked to the different indicators, and that can facilitate, for instance, online search for primary or secondary resources and use content. The expert analysis will be based on literature review of existing documents, and this is made and conceived to be done at a relatively fast pace. A small number of key informant interviews and focus groups will also be made to make sure we include minorities such as women and youth or other marginalized groups, depending on which society we're studying. The team does not require very specific profiles. Ideally, members of the team must have a background in stabilization and or governance and experience in programming in transitional or conflict context. It's expected to be a document of no more than 5 to 6 pages. And it is assumed that a team of 8 people with 4 people focusing on literature review and quantitative data review, and 4 people in country conducting interviews can do the work. The team should include local researchers to use their connections, logistical facilities, knowledge of the environment, paired with international practitioners to support the neutrality and drawing cross-context best practice for programming responses. The questions stemming from each characteristic may seem numerous. It may seem like a lot of work, but they can be answered in the 3 weeks time frame that we give for the completion of this assessment with the help of a grid. The strategy here is not to dive deep into each element at first, but to identify the characteristic that most contribute to fragility in the study context. And here we say that each answer can go into this grid with an answer such as yes all the time, very much, high, very high, often, etc. After the first round of data collections and the set of questions answered, the team can identify the main characteristic of fragility. Answers to the question will be coming from different sources. Hence, the team will have somehow to determine an average response to fill the grid. Since this determination is a bit subjective, at least 2 team members will have to agree on the score given to each question. The team will then have to interconnect the different characteristics to explain the pattern of governance, the root causes of fragility, and identify the opportunities for change. Like I said earlier, the analysis should also include a stakeholder mapping that will allow to identify groups related to different characteristics, and as well identify potential partner for different lines of programming. The analysis will use, and this is an important point for us, will use the historical knowledge gathered from the literature review to inform the root causes and not only take a snapshot of the current situation. SOCIS is meant to be practitioner friendly and to allow rapid and recurrent assessment for immediate programming. It should allow to identify key types of programming depending on the results of the assessments. No fragile context is identical. However, there are certain types of interventions that are common to certain situations. The old diagnostic process should not take, like we said, more than 3 weeks, and it is meant to be repeated to assess changes and the impact of programming. For each characteristic where the country studied is on the negative end of the stabilization continuum, the assessment team should be able to draw a theory of change and draw 2 or 3 programming responses that are good practice and that have proved to be impactful in similar contexts. Here we have identified for each characteristic 3 lines of programming that are large enough to be adapted to different contexts. These are the ones that we have identified for connectivity and diversity, and it can go from communication strategy to leveraging influence of the mission to provide a seat or voice to people who do not traditionally have access to it. It can also be identifying groups representing excluded social sectors to empower them through technical and financial assistance. These are the lines of programming for the power dynamic and security, and I'm not going to go through them all. But again, it can go from needs-based programming to gain community trust to participatory and inclusive conflict diagnostics. For the rule of law, state-society relationship and pattern of governance, the line of programming that we have chosen are first qualitative and quantitative research that will identify issues and attitudes that can increase state legitimacy. The organizations of town halls to give voices to all sectors. And another line of programming chosen is collaboration with municipalities for public service provision with state branding, which not only provides the services, but also increase state legitimacy. For the capacities, and if we go back to the questions, one of the questions was, is there brain drain? So one of the line of programming would be to facilitate diaspora participation in political process and investment in development. Provide technical assistance to the government, financial support for the elaboration of a database of organizations providing technical services. Finally, for the stresses, the line of programming identified are, first of all, strengthening of local organizations involved in disaster preparedness. This is more to answer to external shocks, cash for work to rehabilitate damaged infrastructure and livelihood activities, cross-border dialogue in the case of influx of refugees involving communities and local officials. This 5-page assessment will not be able to capture all details and complexity and is meant to be iterative. It is recommended that each team incorporate research and learning components to the first activities that will allow, in turn, this assessment to be constantly renewed and updated. So the idea, and we had a discussion with a colleague that was suggesting that the research and learning arrow should do the all round, and this is true. This model is simplified, but the idea is that the research and learning should be present throughout the whole process. And finally, the next step. Right now, this tool is under peer review. We're waiting for the comments to incorporate them in the final document. We are also planning on piloting it in the next few weeks in Western Africa and in Haiti. And then there will be the adaptations that come from the actual experiment. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalinda. All right, so we'll go into a few prepared questions, and I see some questions are coming into the Q&A, so please keep those coming and we'll address them in time. Julie, we'll start with you. As Kalinda mentioned, Solstice is meant to be a practitioner's tool, a rapid analysis leading to immediate programming responses. Are we good?
Yeah, I'm just trying to unshare my screen.
Okay. So I know you've mentioned CVP is particularly interested in rapid analysis tools to inform programming in fragile and conflict affected contexts. Can you talk a bit about why urgency and immediate practical application of analysis is important in these environments?
Sure. Look, the moment is right for this kind of tool. I think, you know, and as many ways as we can of understanding and dissecting the environments and the places we work is absolutely critical. Like, the places where we work and where we live are increasingly complex with compounding crises defining the day, right? We, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, we talked about the 3 Cs. We talked about conflict and COVID and climate, and now we're talking about corruption and food insecurity at levels we haven't seen in maybe ever before. You know, Kalinda mentioned at the beginning of her talk that 80% of the places where USAID work are affected by conflict and violence. The vast majority of our humanitarian assistance is developed is delivered as a result of a complex emergency, which is code for conflict, right? As distinct from a natural disaster. Even before the war in Ukraine, the nearly 200 million people suffering from food insecurity were already in contexts affected by conflict. So, I mean, we have to be realistic about the places, the places that we're working in, and design our interventions and our partnerships in ways that react to and respond to the dynamics that we see on the ground. Not surprisingly, in the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention, we spend a lot of time thinking about what prevention should look like. You know, and where we're really coming to is we need to ensure that the agency and our partners have a level of operational readiness to really be in a preventive phase. So what does operational readiness mean? It means that we have a deep understanding and awareness of complexity, and we get that through continuous assessment and analysis of the threats and risks and challenges that our partners are facing. We get it by tracking sentinel indicators, which in turn we identify through our analyses, and through the ability to be flexible and adaptive in our programming. And that's on the USAID side, one of the benefits of our transformation is that we spent a lot of time looking through the acquisition and the ANA process to build in that flexibility so that when we get new data, when we get new information, we can actually pivot appropriately. And you know, for all of this operational readiness is not just for peace building specific programming, but for ensuring that we are integrating a conflict and violence prevention lens across all of USAID sectors. And that, I think, is the place where we need more of these tools to influence how we deliver food programming, how we deliver agricultural support, how we deliver health services. You know, so the moment is really right for it. And I would just note too that within CVP, we have recognized this and are also rethinking our own analytical tools. And so, but hopefully by the end of the summer, the conflict assessment framework, which has been the main analytical tool that our predecessor office has used and now we use, the CAF 2.0 will evolve into the VCAF 1.0. And that was really, you know, it's been a very purposeful evolution to ensure that we have the means to understand non-conflict violence, which again, when you break down that 80%, many of those contexts and countries are affected by high levels of violence that we wouldn't necessarily characterize as conflict. And to take the sort of core lens that we have long looked through And again, widen that aperture so that we're looking at narratives and not just at these ideological or other differences, but looking at interests and incentives, and really broadening the way that we consider key actors, not just as those who can mobilize conflict, but those who influence it and influence the system. And so I think in many ways, we're on the same page as you in rethinking how we ensure that we are flexible, that we are rapid, and that we are undertaking that sort of continuous assessment of our operating environments.
Great. Well, as we said, when we were preparing for this, it's nice to be with like-minded people. Mike, I'm going to turn to you because I know Search has several tools and methods to facilitate strategic thinking and programming decisions in conflict contexts. Can you speak to some of those?
Yeah, thanks, Christy. And maybe before I do, just 2 words of appreciation or 2 reflections about Magloire's presentation and what I really appreciate from that tool. And I think the first is I really appreciate how the second bullet point was rapidity is paramount. I think in this field, conflict issues, social issues, political issues are famously complex, and there needs to be much more of a focus on timeliness and good enough information. In a lot of contexts, you're focused on iterative analysis. I think we often forget that you can tell what's going on much better with a grainy video than with a high resolution photograph. And we see so many teams of consultants across all the societies where we work come in, spend 6 months analyzing a system, and by the time they write their report to inform the World Bank or the UN or whoever, it's already out of date and they miss the boat. And so that focus on rapidity and iterative learning, because often it's not really how our social relationship, what % of people mistrust so and so. Is that number increasing or decreasing? Is the government legitimate? Isn't a number. It's how people feel day over day, and what direction is often much more important than the baseline. And that's why I think that focus on rapidity is really important. And then the other thing I really appreciate is the focus that you termed as sort of resiliency. But so many fragility and analysis tools coming out of the major international institutions and out of other assistance frameworks tend to generate sort of a litany of woes. Of course, you've just come from Haiti, you've come from Somalia, I know we have colleagues from South Sudan and Congo and elsewhere. It's very easy to look at a place like Haiti, let's say, and say there is no political consensus, there is no security, there is no secure economic future for young people, there is no outpouring of international support of their kind there ought to be, there is no environment, and so forth, and there is no, and there is no, and there is no. But you can't begin with what you don't have. And so that focus on resiliency, and then particularly how that ties up to the conversation that we started with, which is on localization and sort of recognizing what is working within the system that you can align from an international donor, could align money behind, from a civil society organization, visibility behind, but how to support what is working in the system. So those are 2 things that really stood out to me in that tool, in this tool, and things that really I really appreciate, and that I think we at Search really resonate with sort of how we understand what makes a good versus a bad fragility and analysis process. In terms of your question, Christy, about how it fits with some of the things we're doing, one of the things that I really appreciate with that is how easily I think some of the key indicators that you have, how that could fit into a monitoring and evaluation framework. So we at Search have subscribed to the Peace Impact Framework, which is out on Connexus. There's about 70 organizations that have subscribed, I think many here. But for those who haven't, it's cnxus.org. You can look it up, Connexus, and it looks at sort of 5 simple themes. So trust and legitimacy, agency, how much individuals feel the ability to change the reality around them, trust and legitimacy of authorities, that is. The level of violence, the market forces that support or that support peace or don't, and a polarization, so sort of intergroup social cohesion. So we look at just those 5 simple themes and look at how we can move with any one of the 150 programs that Search runs, but also all these other organizations, how we can move the needle on those different themes. And I think the way that this tool sort of links that to an analytical process and a wider fragility process is really exciting. I think there's a lot of work that we could do together also to think about how this sort of fragility analysis can fit into an impact framework against which you can benchmark projects at an individual project level, but also as USAID or the wider international community is thinking about how to collectively reduce fragility in, let's say, coastal West Africa or Congo or Somalia or elsewhere. Think about how the whole of intervention can be able to do that. I think, and then finally, I think when we talk about, sort of localization, I think it fits also this kind of analysis to some of our understanding of how we define localization at Search, which means, for us, we say, for us, localization means that people most affected by a problem have the authority and influence over how resources are allocated, how programs are designed, how they're implemented, how they're evaluated. And ultimately, I think the degree to which this is laying out that kind of systems thinking, I think it lays the groundwork for a focus on localization that isn't simply about a top-down localization process. It's about sort of figuring out which elite gets money from which donor capital to serve which political interest. But it's really focused on what's driving change within the system, who's driving change within the system, how people want to see resources allocated, and then aligning those resources behind what people want. And in some ways, localization that's driven only, that's driven by money but ignores power is not going to lead to the kind of results we want. And so the kind of power analysis that you do, and also the way to align and build power behind those who are working for positive change, I think is really exciting. And I saw a comment that came in on the chat, and about sort of the reference to resilience. And I think resilience is itself can be something of a dark word. Resiliency is how much you snap back from suffering, how much you can support suffering. And I think that's not necessarily like always the best way to capture sort of the positive strength of a society to drive change, the strength of an individual, the strength of a society to drive change. But I really do appreciate, and I think it is a really great way to look at sort of what is that capacity for change, to struggle for justice, and how the wider world can align behind what's working within the system. So real hats off to you, Magloire, but to the team that kind of put this together.
Mike says it's much better than I do.
That's why we put him on the panel. Thanks, Mike. Bron, over to you. As Mike mentioned, you're just back from Somalia. So I wonder if you can just speak a little bit about, Solstice is meant to rapidly analyze the full system in which fragility is able to perpetuate in a given context. So how do you think systems thinking can potentially facilitate movement toward peace, stability, maybe even longer term development outcomes in Somalia?
Yeah.
You want it green?
I want it green.
There you go.
Technical Luddite. Thanks, Christy, and thanks everyone on the panel, and congratulations, really, Kalinda, for a terrific tool that you're developing. I agree wholeheartedly with Julie's comments that it's so timely and in line with the donors thinking, not only in the US, but also I think to mention the UK and other driving international forces for assistance in this field. And yes, I just came back from Somalia. I think like other countries undergoing enormous change under global stresses such as the food insecurity, which has been complicated by the drought in Somalia and in the Horn, can exacerbate a lot of the stress points in the conflict setting, but in particular regarding systems thinking in Somalia, I think one aspect that I also really appreciated in your tool was analyzing the power dynamics and security and the phrasing of that, because often it's analyzing politics and security. And power dynamics, I think, is a better way to phrase it, because you don't necessarily, not all political actors have all the power in many places. Obviously, in the case of Somalia, Al-Shabaab is not a political player, but also criminal elements that are alongside business owners that particularly have a lot of power and sway. But I guess I also wanted to talk about how, while localization, I think, is important, I almost view it as, at various levels, not only at the lowest village level, but localization in terms of the host nation itself at the in Somalia case, the FGS, and ensuring that, you look at not just the FGS, but there's the system of the regional partners and how those influences from neighboring countries can not only influence that, you have to look at that system and how not it only affects at a national level, but sometimes regional players will affect that even at a district level or at the village level, and understanding those dynamics and making sure that you understand that in a lot of countries, there's no borders. And in the case of Somalia, you have different clans that, and most would say, and friends that are Somali, that the clans span into Ethiopia, into Kenya, across. And it took me a long time to understand, because I always say, if there's one thing I know about Somalia, it's that I don't know, and that I will continually learn. But I didn't realize how, if a clan does not win in political seats in Northeast Kenya and happen to also not win in their particular region or in the southern part of Ethiopia, that affects the overall power unhappiness in a region within Somalia. And it sort of adds a layer of potential for political contest, or I wouldn't say violence, but certainly some conflict. And so I had never really thought about that. And I think that's something we have to understand within the systems thinking, that it's not just always within the country itself, and these influences that can also counter the inputs and who has at the local level and making sure you talk, of course, you talk to the local stakeholders. I mean, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and if there's anything you learn in Peace Corps, very famous senator always said, all politics are local, and I think we all know that. But I think it's just also important to recognize that you can even be at a community level in, let's say, Gedo region, which is the northern region of Jubaland, and that is influenced by the office of the president in the past, and so those systems also cross into each other. And I also just want to say a bit about, I'm just so happy that this moment in time, we are focusing on research-based programming priorities. One of the reasons I joined this company recently, about 2 months ago, where I work, Valar, we're a small US women-owned business based in Nairobi, and our focus is research-based, evidence-based programming. And in our case, it's as it applies to security sector systems and stabilization. But as Julie mentioned, all of these contexts and the fragility of those contexts in the political security nexus or power dynamics and security nexus affect delivery of all kinds of the systems. And so I think when we go in and have that kind of research assessment, and I'm thrilled to hear you say that it would be continually utilized, because what I've seen as most effective is when you have a network of researchers, local staff, hopefully, that can be dormant and then brought in when needed and then dormant again. And it's not hard to do. And I think it makes for an incredibly more effective engagements, not only in Somalia, but elsewhere. And just to speak quickly about Somalia's sort of current state of play, there's a new president who served in 2012 to 17. And I think the systems thinking is going to be important. And right now for them, it's sort of rebuilding the trust. At this level right now, it's between the federal member states and the center. And the mere fact that President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud brought together the federal member states a few weeks after being elected was such a confidence builder. And that level of governance really has brought down the temperature and the distrust in government. And I like his saying of he's focused on peace within Somalia and with its neighbors. And I think that reflects what I was talking about in terms of influences at a systems level from other areas as well. So thanks.
Thanks. I like what you said about when we're talking now about localization, we need to consider the various levels. This is a friendly debate we have at MSI often, and I see there's a question in the chat from Dr. Carter, so we'll get to you, Lynn, in a second. But first I'm going to ask Kalinda. So you mentioned Solstice is under peer review now, and then the plan is for you to pilot the tool in coastal West Africa and Haiti. You have 15 plus years of experience working on civil society strengthening and governance issues in Haiti. So I just wonder, can you speak a bit to the situation there? And how do you think, programming responses and, even right now in the moment that we're in with GFA implementation strategies being developed, how do you think we can support Haiti?
There's one thing I did not mention, I think, during the presentation, and you're giving me the opportunity to do so. So the idea when that grid is filled is to see for the particular country that you're looking at, which are the characteristics where the continuum is at the negative end, and then focus your programming on these characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
If there are more than 2 or 3, then there's also the idea of seeing how you prioritize, looking at windows of opportunity. In the case of Haiti, it ticks all the boxes. The grid is full and all of them are in the negative hand. And I'm not saying that lightly, it's a difficult situation. The security situation, I mean, we talk about power dynamics. The state right now has lost control over everything that has to do with weapons and munitions, and as well as some parts of the territory around the capital. The number of kidnappings is on the rise every day, more than 20 per day. There were accounts of at least 52 deaths during the last week in some neighborhoods of Port-au-Prince. And what is different from other countries that have a gang issue is that since there is no state authority, gangs have been able to take over strategic locations such as customs. So customs have been closed for 2 weeks now. They have also been able to get control over the fuel terminal. So regularly there are fuel shortages in Port-au-Prince, which, as you understand, will automatically burden all activities, economic, etc. This is one side. When you talk about external shock, Haiti has not been spared either. It has not recovered from the 2010 earthquake, and then we had the 2021 earthquake in the south with regular hurricanes, and the country is one of the most, I would say, climate change vulnerable country in the hemisphere. So when you have a hurricane, the damages are catastrophic, and there is never, and it's interesting, I was looking at the comments, and I'm pretty sure from her name, she probably is from Haiti, and she said that she doesn't like the word resilience. And I understand people in Haiti don't like the word resilience because it often equates to the ability not to die or or equates to resignation.
Mhm.
But that's not what we are trying to talk about. And actually, this is not about necessarily the resilience in the technical sense of the word, is more the ability of a society to resist to different shocks, whether they are political, like the assassination of President Moise last year. The country has not rebounded from this trauma, from this shock. And people don't even realize that, because it is a fact that President Moise was not very popular. So the fact that people have not mourned because they didn't necessarily like him, make them not realize how much of a trauma it is for society for the president to be shut in his own house, and that the next morning you wake up and you don't know who's leading the country. And that since then, they have not been sure. There has been a governance and political crisis since then, with no ability from different social factions to sit at a table and find a consensus on a way forward. All of these things are on top of a years-long socioeconomic crisis. This year, inflation was 23%. Food security is a big issue. On top of hurricanes and earthquake, there has been a very short rainy season. So crops have not given what they were expected to give. All of this is piling up, and this, for me, Haiti is the best example for this, and they interconnect with each other. This is on the base of 100 years pattern of exclusion from the majority of the population on decision-making. I don't know if I answered your question. So in the case of Haiti, and Mike mentioned it earlier, it's about finding windows of opportunity and finding key elements within civil society who can be relevant partners, who have the goodwill to go further, and who have roots in the communities. And I think these opportunities, these windows, they do exist, but it is you're not going to find them from afar. You have to do these iterative initiatives, these iterative assessments, because the situation changes. We were in a meeting yesterday, and the day before, Port-au-Prince was calm, and last night it wasn't a lockdown. So my assessment from last week was not valid anymore. So it has to be iterative, and the windows, they're small. They do not stay open for long. So practitioners and organizations need to be really well informed and quickly to be able to grab them and have an impact.
Absolutely, and hopefully work with civil society partners and other local actors to have a catalytic effect.
Exactly.
Yeah, grabs the window. Okay, Mike, we promised the people Somalia, Haiti, and coastal West Africa. So as we consider application of systems thinking in coastal West Africa, how important is it to ensure linkages not only across communities, but also linkages between communities and local government, as well as cross-border linkages? Ron spoke to some of this. Oh, and Megan threw in GFA. How do you foresee the GFA addressing the challenges in coastal West Africa?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think there's some similar perspectives to what Kalinda was sharing as well in Haiti about some of the structural challenges in the way the personal trauma, the personal lived experience of coming of age in a conflict situation shapes one's political behavior and attitudes. And I think that's probably where I would begin. If we look at sort of how we define, if we look at sort of social cohesion, which is part of the solstice analysis, and also how we sort of see the alternative to conflict, or one of the ways out of conflict is by strengthening social cohesion. In coastal West Africa today, we see three elements. One is sort of vertical cohesion, so sort of trust and legitimacy of authorities. The second, polarization, or its opposite, sort of horizontal cohesion, the relationships between groups. And then the third is agency, the degree to which individuals see themselves and feel like they can determine their future within society. So those are the three elements of social cohesion that we look at. And if you're a young woman or a young man today coming of age in Lave or Sigiri or in Zerakore or Boke, you don't necessarily feel that you have young people and older people as well, but particularly if you're coming of age in that kind of context, amidst a global food crisis, fuel shortages, political institutions that have perhaps never represented you, but particularly you don't feel represented today, or don't feel like you can get justice through a formal process. You're coming of age in a context that's extremely low agency, and that's the case from across coastal West Africa. Particularly for young people, particularly for women, particularly for people who are coming of age in some of the more economically vulnerable sections. And that's something that is compounded in the societies where there are intergroup tensions, social issues, both longstanding as well as those linked to more recent migration, where there's competition over land use or natural resources. And in a context where, for different reasons, as we look across from Guinea to Benin, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, each has a different set of political arrangement and political framework, but all of which, in their own ways, struggle to engage, particularly sort of the lowest, the most marginalized of those who are sort of at the lower end of the economic spectrum. And so that creates a context that's of enormous risk and need to drive social cohesion forward. And the other element, and it comes to your question about the cross-border relationships, is the fundamental economics of the thing, and the degree to which issues, both economics as well as politics and security, are linked across borders. And so and particularly when we're talking about interventions in the economic realm, a lot of the interventions that move the needle are not necessarily peace building and conflict management, but some of the other things in USAID's toolkit, or some of the things that MSI, Tetra Tech, or other kinds of multi-mandated organizations deliver. They're not pure peace building. So in this region, I'd focus particularly on the cattle industry. The way cattle raised in the Sahel often comes to terminal markets in the littoral African states, and the degree to which, as cattle prices rise, as urban demand rises, a more sophisticated banditry system of bandits and criminality has emerged to predate or to prey upon the cattle markets. And as that phenomenon of sort of sophisticated criminality migrates in, that's going to be a destabilizing factor. Without understanding those markets, and without also understanding not only the conflict management tools that USAID can bring, but the economic development investments in value chains that USAID can bring. And then finally, and related to the Global Fragility Act, it was our hope, and we'll see, my hope for GFA rollout in this region is also how it mobilizes the interagency. So if the Department of Agriculture is subsidizing the cattle industry and promoting U.S. investment in the cattle industry within this region, as they are in Nigeria and potentially in this region, how can that attenuate? How can that improve social relations? How can that improve more equitable economics? Or could that be a conflict dumb, rather than conflict smart, a conflict dumb assistance model? It's exacerbating problems and exacerbating the international inequalities. How is Department of Commerce facilitating investments in the cold storage facilities that can, support more equitable as well as less conflictual trading networks? How is, DOD or the other security cooperation strengthening garde nomade, or sort of, mobile policing of the cat, and so forth? And so there's a whole lot of equity from the interagency that can come to bear, particularly when we start looking at some of the network dynamics. And once we do the kind of systems mapping that Solstice provides, then we can start to see ways that some of the other ways that the various US agencies can bring support, in addition to the important role and financial role and support that USAID can provide, both through its CPS and conflict bucket, as well as democracy and governance and economic development and so forth. So I think that's the way we could imagine a GFA type process, and one of the highest potentials of the ability to look across borders, to look at the economics, and to mobilize the whole of US government against the whole of a problem that's multifaceted in a particular society.
Thanks, Mike. I like it. Let's be more conflict smart and less conflict. Sometimes I think we need to be less smart and more human, but that's more of a philosophical debate, I think. All right, Julie, back to you. I'm sure you knew coming to AFP, you want to get out of a GFA question. And Haiti and Coastal West Africa are two GFA priorities. Can you provide for everyone a quick update on the process, potentially including the development of the 10-year implementation strategies and how local consultations are going with that?
So we actually have all of the strategic frameworks complete, or at least drafts, the first drafts. The final versions we expect by the end of the fiscal year. They are not yet public, so I won't go into too much detail, but I will share a few of my own observations having reviewed them. And the first is with respect to the risk and resiliencies. And honestly, I could just paraphrase Mike, because I think this is what I saw across all of these very diverse environments was a recognition that at the heart of many of the challenges are state fragmentation, polarization, governance deficits, economic stresses. I mean, there was a real sort of similarity of high level issues contextualized for each of the countries and regions in which they're taking place. It struck for me, again, to Mike's point, the critical importance of breaking down the silos between technical areas, that, you know, the space now between the democracy, rights, and governance sphere and the conflict sphere is much narrower than it ever was. I think certainly in my own career, having worked in both sectors, that you really see governance deficits and increasing government repression at the center of a lot of what's driving the conflict and violence. And so that's going to push us out of our comfort zones in some ways, but I think again, the sort of continuous assessment of the environment will push back on us to have better responses that span those silos. The other observation I would make is that each mission approached localization, or each post approached localization in their own way, and I thought that was really unique. But across the board, there were real steps towards, if I can use the term, decolonizing aid a little bit, and really making sure that local drivers are meaningfully engaged in the continuous assessment, whether it's the research and analysis, or, as you know, again, in one country had government partners as part of the steering committee. Another country is planning on building kind of a stakeholder base across the entire country. Even in places that are, especially in places that might be inaccessible to donors. And so I think posts took the message seriously about localization and are really embracing it. And the third thing that I was particularly pleased to see was the attention at the interagency level to monitoring, evaluation, and learning. That, I've certainly been in multiple interagency efforts for the last, 21 years, or since September 11. And this is the first time that I've actually seen the interagency really come together at the forefront and identify how we would be able to determine whether or not the interventions that we're proposing will actually have the outcomes that we hope. And so I was particularly pleased to see again that posts had taken that to heart and we're moving forward.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Thanks, Julie. I'm going to turn now to some of the Q&A in the chat. So thanks to everybody who's been dropping questions in there. We'll try to cover as many as possible. First, Kalinda, not surprisingly, is from Dr. Lynn Carter. Could you?
I'm very disappointed if I didn't have one.
We sometimes call her a chief questioner. Could you speak to the level at which the framework is or can be pitched? National versus a region in conflict versus local. How does a team make this decision?
I think it really depends on the demand, on what is the team planning to do. My personal preference is the country level, because the tool looks a lot at the state society relationship, and for it to be complete, it has to take all level of the state, whether it's at the communal level, regional, and the national level. So this is my preferred size. However, it can be different in different cases. In Haiti, taking a regional prism would not be really relevant, as the issues are relatively homogeneous, and everything that has to do with power dynamics, state-citizen relationship is pretty much the same all across the territory. But in Western Africa, for instance, taking the north of Niger, when you think about conflict and VE might be relevant. So it really depends on what you want to do. But again, my preferred framework of analysis would be the country.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna give you another one.
No, yeah, but again, it's like the GFA. In the case of Haiti, they took
Yeah.
Haiti, but they took a region in Western Africa because there was a lot of
Sure.
common issues and homogeneous, I would say, dynamics that make it make sense. And I think it's pretty much the same for the tool.
Great, thank you, Kalinda. One more to you, which I know we've discussed, so I know you have an answer for. To what extent are these models taking into account the standardization of certain cultural norms, such as colonial legacies, and working to reshift and decolonize these processes?
To a large extent. And
That
that's
was a
the goal.
softball for
That-
you.
Then that's the goal, because often these elements are overlooked. And again, I'm going to take the example of Haiti. On the next day after independence, all Lent tenure was abolished. Nobody had no Lent title. And this is an example. And this situation of Lent tenure has had impact on the economic and political life of the country for the last 200 years. An assessment done traditionally today would take a snapshot and would say, okay, smallholders are not able to make ends meet, but it would not necessarily understand the root causes of the situation. And I think this is very important, such as the different dynamics between the elites and the rest of the populations that are often inheritance from the colonial past. All of this has to be taken in consideration if you really want to be serious about solutions.
All right, one more, and then I promise I'll turn to somebody else. There's a few questions coming in about the rapidity of the analysis, so is 3 weeks sufficient? Given, we're the goal of Solstice is to carry this out in a very dynamic context.
It's funny because I was looking at the questions, and there are questions asking if 3 weeks is enough, but there are other questions asking if during this time frame something happens, what do you do?
Yeah.
So I mean, you never have the exact right mark, and that's why it has to be iterative. Because while things are happening, you're also keeping the learning curve, and you keep on readjusting and reassessing. And I think at the end of the day is to have, after these 3 weeks, a base from which you can start programming and continue from there.
Right. Okay, we've got a general question, not specific to the tool, so I invite Bron, Julie, or Mike to chime in. What preventative solutions can be implemented now locally or at the international level to reduce the violent conflicts that might emerge or grow as a result of the struggle over limited food or price spikes that make food inaccessible to many?
So I'm happy to
Thank you.
jump in on this first, and maybe speak generally, and then we can talk in specific cases. But I think this is this is the reason why we in CVP are pushing for conflict integration, to ensure that every sector and every engagement is conflict sensitive and is aware of the context in which it's operating and understands the implications of our assistance in the first place, for good or for ill. And I go back to that, operational readiness model, is that we have to really understand the context. We need these analytical tools. We need to bring local voices to the front of this. And we have to be able to track sentinel indicators. And we have to sort of say, like, what are the things that we know will lead one way or another? And this is where the evidence base and the research base is really critical. We're not new to this, but we have never really effectively harnessed the tools that we have at our disposal to do it systematically, to do it across all of our engagements and all of our partnerships. So I think that, we have the tools there. We have to be able to adapt. We have to be able to track the right things. And certainly, FuseNet is a key tool in that. We need that on the conflict side as well. Right. And they've done a great job of sort of integrating conflict into the analysis that they do. And we don't need bells and whistles. We just need to know the right indicators to be tracking over time through rapid analysis to know when we need to pivot.
Yeah, maybe just a few reflections. I think one is that, we talked about, there was a question just before about sort of the colonial legacies, and I think it's worth remembering that continues, and every conflict that we've discussed today is as much, while it is local, it's also a product of geopolitics. And when we look at the food price spikes, I was just this morning on the phone with my colleague in Central African Republic, where the cost of cooking oil has gone up by 70%, families are skipping meals. That's a product of Russia's war in Ukraine. It's also a product of how predominantly Western countries reacted in terms of decoupling the global economy, which is not to say that that's a decision that has real costs that people around the world will bear, both of those decisions. And there is an obligation for everyone involved in that conflict to understand the externalities of that conflict and do their best to respond to that. And I understand USAID has done some. I think the US government, as well as its other partners, could do more, both on the direct food security dynamics across the Central African Republic, as that's on the mind. Fuel shortages are cutting off humanitarian distributions. There's a need on the financial side for USAID and other donors to step up to understand the immediate humanitarian impacts, as well as the long-term legacy that dependence on food from that part of the world is a result, in some extent, to post-colonial or to colonial era infrastructure decision investments that make it easier to import in a lot of the world than it is to produce locally. Easier to trade with Europe than it is to trade across Africa or other parts of the world. So there's a need for the long term to strengthen the resiliency and economics of the food sector, particularly in places that have had their infrastructure development deeply warped by historical colonial dynamics. That said, in terms of what we do today, particularly on the conflict side of things, I would highlight two. One is to understand the degree to which the lived experience of hunger is shaping. It has always shaped people's political behavior, particularly now in a place like Congo, where already 40% of children were stunted by hunger. As that number goes up, it increases desperation. It manifests in different ways in every society, but as desperation increases, the risk of conflict and violence, a hungry man is an angry man, as they say. And then secondly, there's a need for flexibility within both the US architecture, but also within the programs that it supports. And so things like the Complex Crisis Fund, which is some of USAID's ability to respond rapidly, needs to be fully supported and increasingly supported by Congress to give USAID and others the ability, when there are unforeseen complex crises, to respond quickly and to provide that stitch in time that saves 9. And at the same time, USAID, and particularly non-conflict programs within USAID, should have the flexibility to incorporate crisis modifiers and the ability to integrate conflict responses within food security programs, within other kinds of programs, in order to be able to surge in and address some of the unanticipated social consequences that come up, particularly when programming in fragile or sort of fast changing contexts.
Thanks, and I really appreciate all the comments to date. I guess I would say that in terms of conflict prevention in this time of extreme food insecurity, I think we have to be aware and try to depoliticize assistance. And sometimes it's not in the international assistance power to depoliticize it, right? But just to be aware of it, because trying to utilize the federal level, in the case of Somalia, the Ministry of Planning, and working very closely with the federal member states and their ministries of planning is of paramount. But, recently there was a case where the deputy speaker of parliament hired a chartered plane and flew to a federal member state and didn't notify the federal member state authorities and met with a group that was deemed as contrary to that federal member state. And 10 people died because they saw it as a political move, and also supporting an opposition. And in those instances, the international community is not obviously, nor should have agency over what politicians necessarily do, but I think we need to be aware that sometimes these things will occur, and the more we can help to support the institutional relationships that deliver those, which I believe we do quite well in the case of USAID's assistance. But knowing that in many cases, sometimes these modes of assistance might be diverted in a way, and just being aware of who the partners are is helpful for conflict prevention, both at the government level and with even local partners, and who are they exactly aligned with or not aligned with. The other thing I would just bring up is being aware that this horrific food insecurity and drought in the case of the Horn of Africa is really driving an incredible internal migration to urban areas, and it's overwhelming. In the case of this one capital of a federal member state called Southwest in Somalia, the capital is Baidoa, and it's almost 10 times the population it was a mere 6 months ago, due to the influx of IDPs, and the camps are of course stretched. And so I think there's so many demands to the humanitarian community, and I think as the more we can try to plan and get those resources to help set up for reception areas or anticipate this, because of course when you have such a high influx of migration, that's just going to be compounding the political frictions that can inevitably come up because of the hungry man or hungry woman is an angry person, so to speak. And but I also know that frankly there's also a lack of international donor funds going to these humanitarian responses, and in some cases it's just getting enough money to get enough food assistance out there is the first step. So it's a difficult situation we're in, and I think almost unprecedented because of this unfortunate, tragic invasion of Russia and Ukraine. So, thank you.
Yes, no? Okay. All right, we have 5 minutes left, and I think we've got a good question to end on. And I'll ask it, and I'll maybe use moderator's prerogative to just give one sentence of an answer, and then I promise I'll turn it over to the rest of you. It says, how specific are the programming activity recommendations emerging from the use of Solstice? What I want to say is picking up on something Julie said. Julie, you said, we're not new at this. And I often say, we're not starting from scratch here. So yes, we're in complex environments, but as Kalinda said, there are windows of opportunity that exist. We do have an evidence base for types of programming that can produce this catalytic effect, can produce, some positive change. And so I think that's exactly the premise of Solstice is we have a rapid analysis to lead to immediate programming responses. But the question here, Kalinda, is how specific are the activity recommendations that emerge from the use of Solstice?
They should be as specific as, like I said, a sub-theory of change that will lead to a specific activity. The ones that we have given are things that have been proven to have impact in similar contexts. However, the team doing the assessment will also look at the windows of opportunity, the potential partners. For some of these lines of programming, there will not be a relevant partner to implement it. There will not be a window of opportunity, or there will be something else, but it has to be specific and it has to be taking in consideration the specificities of the context.
Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
I mean, I'd be happy to. I mean, I think one thing to, of going that transition from fragility assessment or analysis to activity is also figuring out what point you also unlock sort of the creative energies and figuring out not only who are the key stakeholders and what's working in the system, but also leading a participatory process of developing, we can say media is very important, but from that understanding that two South Sudanese women creating a soap opera about a detective in a fictional South Sudanese town, which is Subject Esther, a show that my colleagues produce out of Juba. There's a lot of steps that go into that, and keeping that from the analysis side, and then also taking the step back and leaving some of that creative energy, listening to it to the extent that USAID or others are aligning resource behind it, keeping also that open mind for creative solutions, I think. Because at the end, we talked about a wide set of challenges just in this conversation, all of which have multiple then solutions that can fit within that. And I think there's just tremendous room, if we were to take even the most narrow question of sort of the appeal that gangs may have for whether cattle rustlers in coastal West Africa or thieves in Papua New Guinea or the gangs of Haiti. You can imagine a number of different kinds of things that have worked in different places, but that are also going on well in each of those societies. Both what's going well can be invested in, and also how you can support a creative process to generate new locally led solutions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Kalinda. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Bron. Really appreciate the discussion that we've had. Thanks for everybody who dropped questions in the chat and for listening. As Kalinda mentioned, we're piloting the tool. It's under peer review. We'll circle back and let folks know about any adjustments that we make. Also, Megan had dropped the link to the localization and conflict context paper in the chat. Please read it if you like and share. And I think that's all I have. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
for having us.
Thank you.